Before we get started, I should probably outline my stance on piracy, given the subject of this video. I view piracy as a necessary evil for the purpose of preservation. My general rule is that piracy is only justified if there's no other way to legally acquire the product at a reasonable price. Reasonable in this case meaning standard MSRP. So that means stuff that's been out of production for a while, or stuff that was never released in your country. Basically, if your only options are to pay outrageous secondhand prices, or be unable to play the game, movie, whatever at all, then I don't see any ethical issue with pirating it. After all, not 1 cent of that $200 copy of Path of Radiance would have gone to the rights holder anyway, so in this case the "it's not a lost sale" excuse actually has merit. On the other hand, if your reason for pirating is that you just don't want to pay for something, or you have some kind of personal or ideological beef with the creator, then no, it's not justified. You're not entitled to a product you didn't pay for. And I know the excuse is, I wasn't going to buy it anyway, so it's not a lost sale, or no physical good was stolen, it's just copying data. But that's all they are, excuses. If you really had no interest in the thing you're pirating, then you wouldn't have gone out of your way to pirate it in the first place. It takes more effort to pirate something than to just ignore it. Unless, that is, you really do want it, you just don't want to pay for it. Well, tough shit. I don't want to pay the ridiculous upcharge on Apple products. That doesn't mean I can just walk into the store and take them anyway. But that's where the other excuse comes in, that it's not theft because no physical good was taken, it's just copying data. Well, I hate to break it to you, but that data didn't just spring from nowhere. It took a lot of time, money, and effort to create that data, and the people who put in that time, money, and effort did it so they could sell that data. If you use their product without paying for it, that's still stealing. Oh, and while we're on the subject, pirating something over personal/ideological disagreements is just pathetic. If you really disagree with the person selling the product, whether it's over their personal or political views or their business practices, then you shouldn't be consuming their product in the first place. Just nut up and boycott. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the main topic of this video. The other day I got recommended a video by a popular anime YouTuber. I won't say who, mostly because I'm not exactly sure how the unspoken YouTube laws about call-out videos work, but there's a good chance you probably know who I'm talking about. They are a rather unique individual after all. Anyway, in the video they advocate for abolishing the concept of intellectual property and attempted to argue why this would somehow be beneficial to creators. Now, as an aspiring creator myself, I found this idea rather laughable, and unfortunately their supporting arguments spoke of such a baffling ignorance of how business works that I'm honestly surprised they didn't try to argue that entertainment media is a human right that should be provided by the government or something to that effect. Now, it is worth mentioning that I do have issues with our current IP laws, mostly in regards to how companies like Disney have effectively obliterated the public domain, or how corporations straight up ignore fair use and rampantly abuse the DMCA on YouTube in particular. But I should stress that those are issues of corporate, legal, and government corruption, a topic far beyond the scope of this video, and not with the concept of intellectual property itself. Anyway, the core of their argument as to why IP is unnecessary basically hinges on two things: crowdfunding and art commissions. I'll talk about art commissions first because it's the easiest to refute. Basically, they claim that when an artist does a commission and gives it to the commissioner, the artist no longer owns it, and therefore this proves that owning your work is unnecessary in order to profit. Of course, this couldn't be further from the truth, something which I learned firsthand. Artists do in fact retain some degree of ownership over their work, including commissions. And if you've spent any length of time on Twitter, you'll know that artists tend to get very upset about unauthorized use of their work, particularly tracing, recoloring, or any attempt to sell or monetize their art without their consent. So no, art commissions are not an example of a creative business functioning without ownership. But what about crowdfunding? Well, that one is a bit more complicated to explain, but the core idea is equally as ridiculous. The video uses crowdfunding as its main argument for why it's unnecessary for creators to own their work, claiming that revenue from sales is unnecessary because, by crowdfunding, you have already profited through production.
Excuse me, what?
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. Now, full disclosure, I've never owned a business myself, but I have researched the subject, and I haven't based my entire identity around stealing others' work without compensation, so I'd like to think I'm more qualified to speak on the subject. But I guess you should still take what I say with a grain of salt anyway. If you're at all familiar with how the production of, well, anything really, but entertainment media specifically in this case works, crowdfunded or otherwise, then I hopefully shouldn't need to explain how nonsensical that statement is. But for the folks at home, the TLDR is that nobody profits from production, not unless their production is a scam. Then again, they did use Star Citizen as an example of crowdfunding success, so when you're trying to produce something, in this case we'll go with a video game, the money you get in advance, whether from a publisher or through crowdfunding, that isn't profit, that's your budget. That money is meant to cover the cost of production. You know, employee payroll, overhead expenses, equipment, software licenses, basically everything you need to do to keep the lights on and finish the project. Once the game is finished and released for sale, you can start to collect revenue, i.e. money from sales. After the revenue has hopefully recouped the cost of production, that's when you finally see a profit. The only way you could possibly profit from production, assuming you're not running a scam, is if you somehow finished your project under budget. But let's be honest, that's rarer than a good conversion bureau fic, written by Bigfoot. Profit from sales is extremely important to the success and survival of a business. Sales potential is what determines the size of a project's budget. There is a reason subsequent entries in a successful series typically get bigger budgets than earlier entries, after all. A company with no sales, whose projects are funded solely through crowdfunding, is essentially living paycheck to paycheck. An unfortunate reality for many, but not a situation anyone would willingly choose to be in. Also keep in mind that profit from sales is what allows businesses to grow. Bethesda didn't start out making Skyrim. Blizzard didn't start out making WoW, and Rockstar certainly didn't start out making Red Dead 2. Another issue with this proposed zero-revenue crowdfunding system is that the portion of a game or movie's audience willing to help bankroll its development is usually significantly smaller than the portion that would be willing to buy it after release. Take Shovel Knight, for example. By the end of its Kickstarter campaign, Shovel Knight had 14,749 backers, and raised a little over $300,000. Within a year of its release, the game had sold over 700,000 copies. The base game cost about $15, so a very rough spitball estimate would put their revenue at about $10.5 million, and that was just the first year. By 2019, the game had sold over 2.65 million copies. Now, granted, most crowdfunded projects won't see the same kind of insane success as Shovel Knight, but pretty much any project that's even mildly successful will see a bigger audience after release than before, so the point still stands. Now, to be fair, this individual isn't completely talking out of their ass. To their credit, they did attempt to put their money where their mouth is. Sort of. Okay, not really. You see, unfortunately, that attempt came in the form of a Patreon-funded webcomic. Okay, I've actually got a lot to say on this particular subject, but I'm saving that for another video, so I'll try to condense this as much as I can. So the main problem here is that this webcomic isn't a business. I doubt any of the people involved are relying on it as a major source of income. It probably doesn't have a strict release schedule. Being a webcomic, it doesn't have any printing or distribution costs. And since the funding is coming entirely from their existing fan base, they don't really have any marketing costs either. It's not their career, and it's not their money. They aren't actually risking anything in this venture. So of course they don't need to care about revenue, because it's not a business, it's a hobby. Or more accurately, it's a performative virtue signal, but that's beside the point. I know I risk sounding like a hypocrite, being both an aspiring writer and YouTuber myself, but this trend of popular YouTubers doing crowdfunded vanity projects like this is, for lack of a better term, a rather privileged position. I won't knock anyone for going this route, but acting like it's a widely applicable business model is a bit like hearing bootstraps rhetoric from somebody with rich parents. But like I said, that's a rant for another time. Honestly, I could go on about related issues like plagiarism or the various products and businesses that depend on licensing and royalties, but my script is already a lot longer than I originally intended, and I think I've rambled enough already. I guess the best thing I can say about the video is that it makes for a good companion to Razor Fist's equally inane rant. You could say they form the opposite ends of a spectrum, and who doesn't love a good spectrum? Americans, that's who. Get it? Because the Spectrum was a British thing and the Commodore was bigger in the States, and I'll shut up now.